The doorbell rang at 7 a.m., and I couldn't even get to it fast enough. By the time I dragged myself off the couch using the walker my surgeon insisted I keep nearby, my mother's SUV was already pulling out of the driveway, and 3 kids under the age of 8 were standing on my porch with backpacks and a folded piece of paper taped to the oldest one's jacket. I was 2 days out from spinal fusion surgery. 2 days. I could barely stand long enough to make coffee, let alone chase a toddler around a house full of stairs. My phone buzzed before I'd even processed what I was looking at. "Mom, we have a family emergency. Watch them." I typed back with hands that were still shaking from pain medication. "I can't. I'm still recovering. I literally can't bend down to pick anything up right now." The response came almost instantly, like she'd been waiting for exactly this excuse. "Stop making excuses. Family comes first." I stood in my doorway, staring at 3 children who were now looking at me with the particular uncertainty kids have when the adults around them are clearly not okay, and felt something crystallize inside me that had been building for years. I didn't call my mother back. I didn't call my sister Renata either, the one who apparently had an emergency urgent enough to abandon her own children on my recovering, physically incapable doorstep. I made one phone call instead. Not to beg for help. To someone who already knew exactly where my mother and sister had really gone. My name is Josephine, though everyone's called me Jo since I was small enough to still believe my family operated out of love instead of convenience. I was 34 years old, 6 days post-spinal fusion surgery when this happened, still adjusting to a back brace, a walker, and a strict list of movement restrictions my surgeon had practically begged me to follow. To understand why I made the call I made, you need to understand something about my family first. My mother, Patricia, had spent my entire adult life treating me as the family's emergency contact, the reliable one, the daughter who didn't have a husband or kids of her own to complicate things, which in her mind meant my time belonged to whoever needed it most, regardless of what I actually had going on. My sister Renata was 7 years younger, married to a man named Dale who worked long hours in oilfield logistics, leaving her mostly alone with 3 kids under 8. I loved my niece and nephews genuinely, and over the years I'd stepped in more times than I could count. Weekend babysitting, school pickups, the occasional overnight when Renata needed a break. I never resented that. Not really. What I resented was the assumption that my own life, my own body, my own recovery from major surgery, simply didn't factor into the equation. 2 weeks before my surgery, I'd specifically told both my mother and Renata the exact dates I'd be recovering. Explained clearly that I wouldn't be available for childcare, appointments, or anything requiring physical exertion for at least 6 weeks. My mother had nodded along during that conversation, said all the right things about understanding, about making sure I had support during recovery instead of the other way around. Apparently, understanding had an expiration date of exactly 48 hours. What I didn't know yet, standing in my doorway with 3 confused children and a folded note I hadn't even opened, was where my mother and sister had actually gone, and why it had absolutely nothing to do with any real emergency at all. I finally unfolded the note taped to my nephew's jacket, my hands still unsteady from the pain medication I was supposed to be taking on a strict schedule. It was written in Renata's handwriting, rushed and slanted. "Joe, huge emergency, can't explain right now. Mom said you'd understand. Kids have snacks in their bags. Back by Friday. Love you. Friday." Today was Tuesday. 3 days, with 3 kids, 6 days after spinal surgery, and I couldn't even lift my youngest nephew's diaper bag off the porch without wincing. I brought them inside slowly, settling them in front of the television while my mind raced through options. I couldn't call my surgeon's office and ask them to somehow make my spine heal faster. I couldn't call Dale, Renata's husband, because according to my mother's earlier texts, he was apparently handling something at work and unreachable, which struck me as strange given that Renata's supposed emergency should have involved him too. That inconsistency nagged at me. If there was a real family emergency serious enough to abandon 3 kids on my doorstep, why wasn't Dale involved at all? I texted my mother again. What is the actual emergency? I need to know in case something happens with the kids and I need to reach someone. Her response took 20 minutes this time. It's complicated. Family stuff. Just watch them. We'll explain when we're back. Complicated family stuff, requiring both my mother and my sister, but apparently not Dale. I sat with that for a long moment, watching my nephew attempt to climb onto my recliner, my body screaming every time I moved to intercept him. That's when I remembered something. My cousin Teresa, my mother's niece, worked the front desk at the Lakeside Grand Hotel 40 minutes outside town. Teresa and I had always been close, closer than my mother probably realized, and Teresa had a habit of mentioning things she probably shouldn't, simply because she trusted me not to make a big deal out of it. I picked up my phone and called her, not really expecting an answer during her shift. She answered on the second ring. "Joe. Hey, is everything okay?" Teresa's voice was warm, slightly distracted, the sound of a hotel lobby humming behind her. "I'm okay," I said, adjusting myself carefully against a stack of pillows. "Weird question, but has my mom checked into your hotel recently? Or my sister Renata?" There was a pause on the other end, longer than I expected. "Why do you ask?" "Because they dropped 3 kids on my doorstep 2 days after my spine surgery, told me it was a family emergency, and now I can't reach them for details." Teresa exhaled slowly. "I probably shouldn't say anything. Teresa, please." Another pause, then quieter. "Your mom and Renata checked into a suite here Sunday night. 2-night reservation, extended to Friday this morning. There was a man with them. Older guy, expensive watch, definitely not Dale." My stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with my healing spine. "A man? With both of them?" "With your mom, mostly," Teresa clarified. "Renata seemed more like she was there for moral support, or maybe just along for the trip. I only know because I checked them in myself, and your mom made a comment about needing privacy for a business matter. But Joe, this guy wasn't dressed like business. He had on golf clothes and kept calling your mom sweetheart in the elevator." I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, absorbing information that reframed everything. My mother, married to my father for 36 years, currently at some lakeside hotel with a man who wasn't her husband, using my sister as cover, using 3 children as a convenient excuse to offload responsibility onto her injured daughter while she disappeared for a family emergency that had nothing to do with family at all. "Does my dad know they're there?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "I don't think so," Teresa said carefully. "Should I not have told you this?" I looked over at my nephews, now fighting over a toy on my living room floor, completely unaware that their presence in my house was the direct result of their grandmother's affair. "No," I said quietly. "You did exactly the right thing. I didn't confront my mother immediately." I sat with that information for the rest of that first day, managing 3 kids on a body that wasn't ready for any of it. My youngest nephew requiring lifting I genuinely wasn't supposed to be doing, my back screaming protests with every small movement. I called a neighbor, Diane, an older woman who'd known our family for years and who owed me a favor after I'd watched a dog during a hospital stay months earlier. She came over that evening, helped with dinner and bath time, gave my body the break it desperately needed while my mind worked through what I actually wanted to do with what Teresa had told me. I wasn't interested in dramatic confrontation. I wasn't interested in calling my father immediately and blowing up 36 years of marriage over a phone call made in anger. What I wanted was clarity, and maybe, if I was honest with myself, a small measure of leverage against a mother who'd spent my entire life assuming my time, my body, and my boundaries existed purely for her convenience. The next morning, still exhausted, still in pain, I texted my mother again. "The kids are fine. When exactly is this emergency resolving?" "Should be done by Friday like Renata said," she replied. "Thank you for understanding, Joe. This means a lot." Understanding. As if I had a choice in any of this from the beginning. I spent that second day quietly gathering more information, not out of vindictiveness, but because I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before deciding what came next. I called my father directly, careful, testing the waters without revealing what I already knew. "Dad, random question. Do you know where Mom actually is right now?" She said family emergency, but the details don't add up. There was a pause on his end, confusion evident in his voice. She told me she's at a business conference with your sister. Something about Renata's work networking event. Two completely different stories. My mother had told me one lie, my father another, neither of them true, both designed to explain the same 3 days away. That's when I understood I wasn't the only one being managed here. My father deserved to know something wasn't adding up too. I didn't tell my father everything, not yet. I simply said, gently, "Dad, I think you should probably double-check that. Something feels off, and I don't want you blindsided by whatever's actually happening." He went quiet in a way that told me he already had suspicions of his own, ones he'd probably been pushing aside for longer than I realized. "I'll look into it," he said finally, his voice heavier than before. I spent the rest of that day focused on the kids, letting my father handle whatever he needed to handle on his end, trusting that a 36-year marriage came with enough shared history for him to ask the right questions once he started looking. Thursday evening, my phone rang. It was my father, his voice tight with a kind of controlled anger I'd rarely heard from him in my entire life. "I called the conference organizers Renata supposedly attended," he said. "There was no conference this week. I called Renata's office. She took personal days, not business travel. Joe, do you know something I don't?" I hesitated for only a moment before deciding he deserved the truth, delivered as gently as I could manage. "Teresa saw them at the Lakeside Grand. Mom checked in with a man who wasn't you, Dad. Renata was there too, but it sounded more like she was just along for the trip." The silence that followed lasted so long I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Okay," he said finally, his voice steadier than I expected. "Thank you for telling me. I need to think about how I want to handle this." I didn't ask what that meant. I understood in that moment that whatever happened next between my parents wasn't mine to control or predict. My job had simply been to stop absorbing a lie I hadn't agreed to be part of. Friday morning arrived, and with it, my mother and sister, pulling back into my driveway with tired, sunburned faces and a story about how exhausting the emergency had been. They had no idea my father was already waiting inside my house when they walked through the door. My mother's face went through several distinct emotions in the span of about 3 seconds when she walked through my front door and saw my father sitting at my kitchen table, arms crossed, waiting. "Robert," she said, her voice pitched carefully between surprise and forced normalcy. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same question," he said quietly. "Except I already know the answer. Lakeside Grand Hotel. Sunday through today. I have the reservation confirmation, since apparently your friend at the front desk isn't quite as loyal to your secrets as you assumed." My mother's eyes cut sharply to me, understanding immediately where the information had come from. "Josephine, you went digging into my private business. You dropped 3 kids on my doorstep 2 days after spinal surgery," I said, my voice steady despite the exhaustion in my body. "You lied to me about an emergency. You lied to Dad about a conference. I didn't go digging. I just stopped accepting a story that didn't add up." Renata stood frozen near the doorway, guilt written plainly across her face in a way my mother's composure hadn't quite allowed yet. "Mom asked me to come," Renata said quietly, "mostly to our father. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't think it was my place to say no to her." "You're 31 years old," my father said, not unkindly, but firmly. "You could have said no." My mother finally spoke again, her voice losing its earlier composure. "Robert, it's not what you think. It's complicated. It's actually very simple," my father said. "You were with another man. You used your grandchildren as a cover story, and you used your daughter, who just had spinal surgery, as free childcare so you could do it without anyone noticing." The kitchen went silent except for the sound of my nephews playing in the next room, blissfully unaware of the conversation reshaping their family in real time. My mother didn't deny it again. She simply sat down slowly at the table, the fight draining out of her all at once. My father didn't yell. I think that surprised my mother more than anything else could have. 36 years of marriage ending not in dramatic shouting, but in quiet, exhausted clarity. "I need time," he said, standing up from the table. "I don't know what this means for us yet, but I know I can't sit across from you tonight and pretend everything's normal." He left my house that evening without another word to my mother, though he hugged me carefully, mindful of my back brace, and thanked me for telling him the truth even though it clearly cost me something to do it. My mother stayed behind, sitting at my kitchen table long after my father's car pulled out of the driveway, staring at her hands like she didn't recognize them. "I never meant for it to affect you," she said finally. "The kids, your surgery. I just needed somewhere to put them while I figured things out." "That's exactly the problem," I said. "You needed somewhere to put your responsibilities, and you assumed my body, my recovery, my entire life could just absorb whatever you didn't want to deal with yourself. That's not new, Mom. That's just the clearest example of it I've ever gotten." She didn't argue with that. I think, for the first time in years, she actually heard it. The town found out within a week, the way small towns always eventually find out everything. Teresa hadn't spread anything intentionally, but hotel staff talk, and Robert's own quiet inquiries at Renata's supposed conference venue had raised enough questions that word traveled faster than any of us could control. My parents separated 3 months later, not dramatically, but definitively. My mother moved into a smaller apartment across town. My father slowly started coming to Sunday dinners at my house again, something he hadn't done consistently in years, always mindful now of asking before assuming I was available. Renata and I had a harder road back to normal, though we're getting there, slowly, built now on actual honesty instead of assumed obligation. I don't regret that phone call to Teresa. I don't regret telling my father the truth, even though it changed my family in ways none of us expected that Tuesday morning. What I regret is 34 years of believing my body, my time, and my boundaries were simply resources for my family to use whenever convenient, without ever having to ask. So I'll ask you what I've asked myself since that morning on my porch. If the people who were supposed to protect you kept assuming your life existed for their convenience, would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace? Or would you have finally made the one phone call that changed everything?